History buffs of Reddit, what is one of the most fascinating stories you've learned that no one seems to talk about and can't be found in textbooks? I may not be too much of a history buff, but I really like the story of Leo Major. Leo was a Canadian soldier serving in World War II. He was assigned to the division in charge of liberating the Netherlands. One day in the summer of 1944, he was alone on reconnaissance duty when he saw two German soldiers walking nearby. He killed one and captured the other, then captured their commanding officer and an entire German garrison. After killing a couple more, he came under fire from other German soldiers and kept walking. He single-handedly captured 93 German soldiers. In February of 1945, a truck Leo was in hit a landmine. He broke his back, a few ribs, and both ankles, and was told he would be discharged. Leo couldn't give enough ducks, however, and a week later he snuck out of the field hospital he was in and stayed with a Dutch family. After getting better, he made it back into his battalion and volunteered to do reconnaissance of the city of Zwolle. Once he departed, he decided to take the city himself. He convinced a German soldier to relay a message back to the German army, then through the night ran around the town making all the noise he could. He shot bullets, threw grenades, captured German soldiers, burned down the Gestapo, and cleaned out the SS building in Zwolle. His tactics were so effective he convinced the German army that the entire Canadian army was invading the town. So by the morning the town was free of Germans and the Canadian army just marched in. He has a street named after him in that town now. Something I read long ago on Reddit, and have saved to my mostly dead other username. During World War II, the Japanese outfitted special planes. Some were designed to be launched from submarines, with enough range to reach the west coast of the United States. The goal was to use incendiary bombs to start wildfires in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. One pilot, Nobuo Fujita, successfully dropped his bombs over the forest near Brookings, Oregon. Fortunately, a storm the night before had dampened the forest, and the fire started by Fujita's bomb was quickly controlled by the Forest Service. 18 years later, in 1962, Fujita returned to Brookings. He brought with him his family's heirloom, a katana that was over 400 years old. Fujita apologized to the townspeople for his actions during the war, and revealed that if the townspeople demanded it, he would ceremoniously kill himself, commit seppuku, with the sword to make reparations for his actions. The townspeople would have none of it. Fujita was made an honorary citizen of the town and returned to visit it several times during his life, including one trip to plant trees in the forest he had bombed decades before. After his death in 1997, his daughter returned to Brookings and scattered some of his ashes there. The Fujita family katana is on display in Brookings, after being given to the town by Fujita as a token of friendship. Reddit fucks it. I've told this story before, but it never fails to amuse me. Strap in, boys and girls, it's time to learn about that time in pre-revolutionary France where bleeding from your anus was a fashion statement. In early 1685, King Louis of France developed a fistula, a small channel near his anus, resulting in great pain. Fistulas, much like the Wu-Tang Clan, ain't nothing to duck with. Eventually the pain got so bad that he couldn't ride a horse, sit for long periods, which is kind of important when you're a king, or even make a bowel movement without regretting it immensely. The normal remedies were applied, enemas and poultices from morning until night, with zero effect. Louis decided, you know what? Duck it. Let's go down the surgical route. Unfortunately for Louis, at the time there was no surgical route. He hired a surgeon barber named Charles Frenois Felix and asked him to fix him. Not entirely stupid and not willing to risk ducking up a novel surgery on the King of France, Felix requested 6 months to practice, which he did on prisoners. Live, healthy prisoners, sometimes as many as 4 a week. In an era where antiseptics and anesthetics didn't exist, the success rates were about as you'd imagine, although at least some of the prisoners survived, and eventually Felix felt confident enough to perform the surgery on the king. And it worked. Within 3 months, the king was riding his horse like nothing had happened, and Felix was the talk of the town. People were desperate to emulate the king so badly that people who were entirely healthy would pay Felix to perform the surgery on them, and those less willing to suffer, or at least less willing to pay, would fake having the surgery, wearing bandages known as Le Royale to mimic the king, and pretend that they too were cool and with it, even though with it meant suffering from a painful condition of the anus. In World War II, there was a Spanish spy named Joan Pujol Garcia who approached the Allies to work for them. When they refused, he approached the Nazis, and they accepted him, giving him the codename Arabelle. Once he earned credentials working as a Nazi spy, he approached the Allies again, this time getting a job as a double agent, codenamed Garbo. This is where it gets unbelievable. He fed the Germans a combination of misinformation, true but useless information, and high value information that always got to the Germans just a little too late. He even started a spy network consisting of 27 subagents of his own. Keep in mind that not a single one of these subagents existed. They were completely imaginary. But regardless, he submitted expense reports for them and had the Nazis giving him money to pay their salaries. At one point, when he had to explain why some high value information got to the Germans late, he told them that one of his spies had died. He actually got the Germans to pay the imaginary spy's imaginary wife a very real pension for her loss. Not only did his false information get the Nazis to waste millions of dollars, but he was also instrumental in convincing the Nazis that the attacks on D-Day were just a diversion, and the real attack was yet to come, keeping vital German resources away from the front lines. He is one of the only people to ever get an Iron Cross from the Germans, which required Hitler's personal authorization, since he wasn't a soldier, and an MBE from King George VI. 1014 AD, after defeating a large Bulgarian army at the Battle of Cledion, Byzantine Emperor Basil I had 99 of every 100 prisoners blinded, leaving each 100th man with one eye so that he could lead his comrades home. Upon seeing his thousands of blinded soldiers, the Bulgarian emperor reportedly died of a heart attack. Basil I was known thereafter as Basil Bulgarslayer. Diarrhea was so widespread and common in the 19th century that people would develop opium habits because opium makes you constipated. Edit. Well, that escalated quickly. As for the exact diseases and reasons that people had diarrhea, I can only say that the 19th century was gross and nobody knew proper sanitary practices. I'm glad you guys all enjoyed debating Imodium until Imodium is made from opiates. If you want to learn more about opium, diarrhea or the combination of the two, then Google it because I'm busy and Google has better resources than I. Thanks for upvoting everyone. The May incident in World War II. American submarines were very good at getting away from Japanese surface ships. This was because the Japanese thought American submarines could only reach a much shallower depth than they actually could, and they never set their depth charges to these deeper depths. Congressman Andrew May decided it would be a good idea to hold a press conference announcing this fact. From then on, the Japanese set their depth charges to these deeper depths. Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of the US submarine fleet in the Pacific, estimated that May's security breach cost the United States Navy as many as 10 submarines and 800 crewmen killed in action. He said, "I hear Congressman May said the Jap depth charges are not set deep enough. He would be pleased to know that the Japs set them deeper now. Loose lips sink ships." George Washington was an amazing man, but very proper and stern, but also revered by all. But one guy thought it was perhaps overblown, and was talking smack that George wasn't all that awe-inspiring in person. Governor Morris thought that it couldn't be that intimidating meeting George Washington, so Alexander Hamilton made him a bet, if he would, upon meeting the general, clap him on the shoulder and say, "My dear general, how happy I am to see you look so well," which would be the modern equivalent of saying, "Hey Georgie boy, how they hanging?" Hamilton would buy an expensive dinner for him and 12 of his friends. Well, Governor Morris did, and won the bet. But Washington immediately removed Morris's hand from his shoulder, stepped away, and used Morris with an angry frown until the trespasser retreated in confusion. Hamilton paid up, yet at the dinner Morris declared, "I have won the bet, but pay dearly for it, and nothing could induce me to repeat it." The dude could literally end you with a stare. Edit. Governor Morris, not Governor Morris. That was his name, not his title. Thanks you Indike1NG. Edit number 2 you impeach Trump of it recommends Washington. A Life by Ron Chernow, same guy who wrote Alexander Hamilton, upon which the musical Hamilton was based. Edit number 3, if you haven't seen George Washington by Brad Neely, well you're one of today's lucky 10,000. Edit number 4 other fun Washington facts. He wrote a book on etiquette as a child, and stopped a military coup by putting on his glasses. I know so much random history trivia, but of course at this moment, I can't think of anything truly fascinating. Not really fascinating, but funny, is the Lion of Gripsholm Castle. As a part of some diplomatic back and forths, Frederick I of Sweden received a lion from the ruler of Algeria. It was now up to the royal taxidermist to make sure the lion was restored to its former glory. During the 1730s however, not a great deal of Swedes had ever actually seen a lion. The only real thing he had to go on was the coinage which showed lions in profile. The result, yeah. Edit. Thank you so much for the gold. Kind person. I'm happy I made you, and all the rest laugh. And my most sincere apologies for the nightmares. I'm also editing to include a link to the actual story. The story of the Bloody Benders, a family of serial killers in southeast Kansas in the 1870s. They let travelers stay and eat at their home, for a fee, of course, and would kill them during dinner, steal anything of value that the travelers had with them, and bury the bodies in the yard. It makes sense why the Benders aren't included in textbooks, but other famous criminals are often included and even become folk heroes. Jesse James is a prime example. At least we're all well versed in the history story of removed now. Peter the Great often forced dwarfs to get married and him and his friends would get drunk and attend the wedding. He had a fascination with dwarfs, and he once forced someone who had made him angry to marry a dwarf. Edit. Since this post is getting a lot of attention, I thought I'd share that Peter basically had a fraternity, and it was called the All Joking, All Drunken Synod of Fools and Jesters. They would drink and party basically all the time. Here's a Wikipedia link to read more on it. When Philip of Macedon had ravaged many Greek city-states, things were looking bad for Greece. He then turned his attention to Sparta, sending the doomed state a letter that read, "More than you are advised to submit without further delay, for if I bring my army into your land, I will destroy your farms, slay your people, and raze your city." The Spartans sent back a rather to the point reply, "More than if." Not that it can't be found in a textbook, but it is never talked about in the US unless you take very niche university courses. The history of modern Greece, basically at war with foreign entities or themselves constantly between 1910 to 1986. Two different fascist regimes, thwarted communist uprisings, the expulsion of a king, and the return of the king like 3 times before being kicked off for good. Larger than life political figures such as Venizelos and Papandreou. Essentially the fighting around World War I started with the First Balkan War against the Ottomans in 1912 and didn't end until 1922 when they were defeated in Anatolia by Ataturk's army. The end of this fighting led to the League of Nations decreeing that all Muslims in Greece must migrate to Turkey and all Christians in Turkey to Greece. As you can imagine, this started a lot more turmoil in the smaller nation, as it was forced to bring in about 35% of their population's worth of people in refugees that didn't speak their language. That was just the beginning and I could go on and on, but who knows if anyone will read this. More people may know about this now compared to if you had posted this question like 6 months ago, but the story of the Clotilda, the last slave ship to carry slaves from Africa to the US. The importation of slaves into the US had been outlawed by the federal government in 1808, but the international slave trade was still active. In 1859, the captain of the ship bet a rich man that he could import some slaves from Africa. He sailed that year and made it back, smuggled them into port at night, took them up the river and then transferred them to a steamship and burned the Clotilda. The slaves were split according to the people who fronted the money for the captain to sail and were enslaved alongside the American-born slaves and were freed after the Civil War. The captain was tried, but not convicted. The slaves settled on recovered land and founded a town called Africatown that's still there. It got launched back into the news recently because there's been a lot of attempts to find the last US slave ship and people believe that they found it a few months ago. Not quite the same thing, but I'm surprised at how little is known about Mansa Musa's famous pilgrimage to Mecca, considering how often it's brought up. The economic impact of his generosity is infamous. He gave away so much gold that its value in the Nile River Valley tanked for over a decade, and he ended up borrowing it back at insane interest rates to stabilize the economy of Northern Africa. Which raises the question in my mind, if his economic advisors could understand that borrowing it back would mitigate the inflation he caused, why couldn't they foresee it in the first place? I've asked this question multiple times on all the history subs and I've never gotten an answer. I recently finished Killers of the Flower Moon, which was a piece of interesting history about the systematic murders of the Osage Indians around the 1920s in Oklahoma. Without going into every little detail, the Osage Indians were given head rights over land that contained oil. They were essentially given royalties from miners to come and mine for oil. It actually ended up making them the wealthiest people per capita at the time. Of course, some white folk weren't too impressed and then started systematically murdering them so that the head rights would be passed on to a relative whom happened to have a white husband, as he would be allowed to legally take possession of the head rights. It was investigated many times with nothing turned up until Hoover decided to take a much bigger vested interest in the case and assign a team to handle it. It was a pretty important case as it gave Hoover the impetus to increase the size of his department and implement new ideas as a framework moving forward for the future Department of FBI. I think it was called Dodge at the time. Anyways, I hadn't heard about this and never knew just how much these people went through at the hand of common white folk around them at the time. Very interesting read and highly recommend it. Robert Liston 1794-1847, a surgeon. In fact, he was described as the fastest knife in the West End and could amputate the leg in 2.5 minutes. The faster the surgery, the more likely the recovery, though during this particular amputation he went so quickly he also removed his patient's testicles. However, he also amputated a man's leg in less than 2.5 minutes, who would later die of gangrene. In his haste, he accidentally cut off his assistant's fingers, who would later die from gangrene, and, apparently, cut through the coattails of a surgical spectator, who was so scared he died of fright, this becoming the only surgery with a 300% mortality rate. When Ivan I of Russia married Zoe Sophia Paleologina, niece of Dragaces Paleologus or Constantine XI, her uncle gifted them a library along with many other treasures. This library somehow survived the burning of Moscow in 1493 and continued to be passed down to her son, Vasily II, and then on to her grandson, Ivan IV. During Ivan IV's reign of terror, the second half of his reign, he feared the library was too precious a treasure and worried it would be stolen. So he and a few men took the collection out of Moscow, what was most likely a 1-3-day horse ride, and buried the books, possibly in a vault, to ensure the location of the library would never get out. He had the men killed. Ivan IV died before the location of the library was ever revealed. We have no idea what could have been in this library or if the contents have even survived, though some historians have speculated that Plato's Hermocrates, the final dialogue pertaining to Atlantis, could have been part of the collection. There's no proof that this is true. The Battle of Saragahi, 21 British Sikh soldiers were attacked by 10,000 Afghans. All the Sikhs fought to the death and brought down a lot of Afghans. It, deservingly, should be considered one of the greatest last stands of all time. Edit. Holy cannoli, I did not expect this to blow up this much. Thank you guys so much. And I'm glad so many people know about the amazing story of the Sikhs. Sybil Ludington. She was, essentially, perhaps oversimplifying, the female, teenage Paul Revere. At only 16 years old, she rode through New York in 1777 to alert local militia, not dissimilar to the famous Revere, but reportedly, this young woman rode more than twice the distance of Paul Revere's ride, while being significantly younger, 40 miles at only 16, in the middle of the night. She also saved her father from being captured by royalists. She lit candles surrounding her house and gathered her siblings to march around the house and give the illusion that troops were guarding the residence. The antagonists fled. She is so underappreciated in the long term of history. Source, for non-believers. Edit. Revere supposedly rode 20, while Sybil rode 40. Helen Keller's socialist activism. She was literally a card-carrying member of the Socialist Party and spent most of her adult life fighting for socialist causes, but the only thing most people remember her for is being blind and deaf. Girl was an activist, disabilities notwithstanding. P.S. She's the only socialist to appear on American currency, Alabama State Quarter. The Dancing Plague of 1518 is always a bit of an interesting read. Fairly short wiki article, noticeably missing a resolution, but somewhat interesting nonetheless. More than the Dancing Plague, or Dance Epidemic, of 1518 was a case of dancing mania that occurred in Strasbourg, Alsace, in the Holy Roman Empire in July 1518. Around 400 people took to dancing for days without rest, and over the period of about 1 month, some of those affected collapsed or even died of heart attack, stroke, or exhaustion. The battle for Schlosita. If anyone told you that tankers from the 12th Armored Division of the United States fought alongside German Wehrmacht soldiers led by an SS Hauptsturmführer as well as French POWs to defend a castle with a famous tennis player of the time, two former prime ministers of France and Charles de Gaulle's sister, against an attacking force of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, you'd have called bullet upon bullet, upon bullet, but that is exactly what happened. In a small castle near Ritter in Austria, the high-profile prisoners were segregated in the latter part of the war. In May, a prisoner escaped with a letter to Allied forces, detailing the names and location of the high-value imprisoned French citizens. The first Allied unit he encountered was unable to effect a rescue, but started toward the prison before retreating back behind Allied lines. During this time, the head of the prison died under mysterious circumstances, and the second in command deserted, along with the host of SS guards. The prisoners, meanwhile, had taken over the prison and commandeered the arms left behind. In the nearby town, Wehrmacht troops, sick of the war and the Nazis, had deserted and formed a resistance unit that protected the citizens from Nazi hardline loyalists and SS retaliation. Major Joseph Sepp Gangl approached the unit of the 12th Armored under a flag of truce and requested aid. Captain John Lee agreed immediately, positioning his tanks in the city square as a show of force. Advised of the tenuous situation in the former prison, Lee set off with a number of tanks, but was unable to cross a small rickety bridge leading to Schlosita with all his forces. He proceeded with his tank, the Besotten Jenny, 2 squads of riflemen, Major Gangl, and a truck with a 10-man Wehrmacht Kanonkoka crew. On the way, they encountered a group of SS troops attempting to blockade the road, who they promptly ventilated. Arriving at the castle, the captain and the major were greeted by the unlikely sight of French prisoners working side by side with Hauptsturmführer Kurt Siegfried Schrader to shore up the castle defenses. The motley crew was not best pleased with the rescue force, that didn't even quite make up a full platoon, but were happy to see any reinforcement. Lee staged his tank at the castle entrance, and the POWs, the Wehrmacht, and the 12th Armored crew deployed around the castle in a defensive perimeter. The year was on. The next morning, a Waffen-SS group numbering over 100 launched their assault, one of the opening salvos destroying the tank that had been the heavy weapon support for the Schlosita defenders. The attack continued in waves, with probing during the night to find weakness in the defenders' lines. Even after being ordered by Captain Lee to seek shelter in the castle, the French POWs stayed on the front, pouring a heavy volume of fire at the attacking SS troops. Morning after pillbox, the following day opened bleakly, with sporadic gunfire continuing throughout the night, as well as repeated grenade blasts and 88mm cannon fire. The defenders were running low on ammo. Somehow, the telephone lines back to the nearby town had not been destroyed, and comms remained intact for the duration of the battle. Lee and Gangl called back for the reinforcements, and they arrived in the afternoon to stomp a mudhole in SS ass. The strangest battle of an insane war came to a close. It was 5 days after the Führer died from self-inflicted high-velocity lead poisoning, and 2 days before the official surrender of Germany. The Battle of Attu. It was the only battle of World War II fought on US soil. Attu is an island in the Aleutians. The Japanese invaded it intending to, who the hell knows, it was far too remote to serve as a staging for an invasion of the mainland. The American soldiers who were sent, they had originally been slated to go to North Africa. They were sent to the Arctic. In the spring, with gear meant for fighting in the desert, they lost more men to the elements than to the Japanese. I'm a nurse and a few years ago I had a resident who was in this battle. To his dying day he was reluctant to talk about it, even 70 years later. What I shared here is all he would tell me. I wish more people realized how truly post-apocalyptic life after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was. In Britain, we had large cities made of masonry, aqueducts, running water, lawyers and accountants, central heating, financial derivatives, a thriving civilization. After the collapse, we lost all of that. The plumbing and concrete broke down. Nobody knew how to fix it. People built mud huts inside old stadium and amphitheaters, using them as forts. That's some diamond city at there. It took centuries for the economy to recover to the point that currency was needed again, rather than bartering. A side point. Back in the day, York and Thebes were in the same country. That still blows my mind. How after Alexander the Great conquered Persian, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, the Persians got mad and surged back to power. This cut off an entire Greek empire in current-day Afghanistan. They had contact with the Chinese. Some Afghanis and Pakistanis, especially the Pashtuns, have blue eyes, blonde hair, light brown hair, even red hair, and claim they are descendants from this empire. Voyagers who worked for fur trade companies lived gross lives. Since they spent most of their time in a canoe with limited supplies, they made do with what they had. Gross stuff below. They were often missing teeth, so when they drank tea they would shove a chunk of maple sugar in their teeth gaps and drink tea through it. When the tea was done they would remove the sugar chunk, wrap it up and save it for later. The number one cause of death for a voyageur was complications of hernia because they carried heavy cargo on their backs. The average sack was 90 pounds and they would make a contest out of who could carry the most. Often 3 and for the show-offs 4 packs. That's 360 pounds of cargo, so of course guts would herniate. They would tie their sashes as tight as possible around their stomach to keep all their internal organs in place. Since they tried to keep limited supplies so they could carry the most cargo, they would often use their toques as bowls. They would wax the yarn to waterproof the hats, so they would eat out of their hat that had hair, sweat, skin and probably bugs in it. They didn't pull over to the shore to go to the bathroom. When you had to go you would go over the side of the canoe. This applies for both number 1s and number 2s. So if you had to eat you were eating in front of the rest of your crew. Their hygiene was awful. They often would not bathe or clean themselves up as it protected their skin from bugs in the sun. When they got close to a rendezvous point they would somewhat attempt to shave and clean themselves up. They made do with what they had, but learning about them has made me appreciate modern amenities like showers, toilets, access to health and dental care. Edit. Holy crap, I got gold. I know this is cliche but thank you. Here's some quick fun voyageur facts as a thank you. They paddled about 50 strokes per minute and the person who could carry a tune and played the fiddle were paid the best. They used music to keep pace and move faster. In Canada there were 2 main fur trade companies, Hudson Bay Company and Northwest Company. Those 2 companies hated each other and would get in fights all the time. Turf wars were a real thing. They were often under 5'7" because having tall people in the canoe made it difficult, and it was harder work for tall people because it took more effort to swing the paddle down. And lastly, this song was their jam. It's about when they die they want to be buried with all the wine and their head under a tap. Gross party animals to the end. The Itch Wars. Oh my god, this is funny and intriguing. You all know about the Soviet gulags, correct? Well, within them there became a society of criminals that organized together as thief-in-laws. In Russian, they became commonly known as the Vors. They were viciously anti-authority. They must refuse all orders and all work and spit in the face of officials. These methodicas were hardcore. Well, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin allowed prisoners to fight them on the front, in exchange for their freedom. So these guys, who are just anti-authority, were now fighting on behalf of the Soviet regime. The interesting thing though, is that these men were career criminals. So after the war, once they were free, they continued to commit crimes, and many were sent back to the gulags. Now the Vors that agreed to not fight the Nazis began to call these traitors sukas or itches in English. The Sukas became a sect and were the bottom of the pyramid of the Gulag's hierarchy. However, these guys were now war-hardened fighting machines. Because they took so much hit from the wars, they eventually rebelled and the gulags were torn apart in extremely bloody battles. Literally tens of thousands of prisoners died. It was no joke. And the guards allowed them to get away with it too because it was a means of population control. Thus, the Itch Wars. The doom of the Mamluks is to this day one of the grimmest and most interesting stories in history. The Mamluks were a caste of Islamic slave lords, in that they were slaves, owned by the Caliph, but were also lords of vast territories in Egypt and the Levant. They were almost exclusively young boys captured in the Caucasus and Ukraine who were brought to the Ottoman Empire, converted to Islam, and turned into slave soldiers. The Mamluks were very important in the Muslim world. They fulfilled a role similar to the Crusaders. They were elite, wealthy holy warriors, and seen as the defenders of the faith. The Mamluks were at times independent, but were eventually subjugated by the Ottomans. At some point the Ottoman Sultan of Egypt grew tired of the factionalism and pride of the Mamluks. He announced a jihad, and invited the Mamluks to the citadel in Cairo to celebrate, then had his own men on the ramparts with crossbows ready to slaughter them as he entered the citadel. Thousands of the Mamluks were killed instantly, and after this the Sultan sent riders across the empire to hunt down the remaining Mamluks and their families and destroy or seize their estates. The remaining Mamluks briefly established territory in Abyssinia, and fought against the Ottomans, but were eventually defeated. The last American Civil War widow actually died in 2003, and the government is still paying pensions to 2 children of Civil War veterans. Edit, added American. Starfish Prime, that time when a space nuke could be seen from Hawaii and the resulting EMP knocked out streetlights in Waikiki. Almost no one I know knows about this and it wasn't in any school books we read. You'd think a space nuke, to see if we could blow up an asteroid belt, would make it into textbooks, especially when tens of thousands of people witnessed a sun in the sky at nighttime. John Tyler, born in 1790 and 10th President of the United States, has 2 living grandchildren. The beginning of the Great War is not nearly as cut and dry as many history books would lead you to believe. Yes, Germany and Austria-Hungary made many missteps, but Serbia was truly a den of snakes that constantly fomented trouble in the region. In matter of fact, the main reason they, and make no mistake, by they I mean the government itself was well aware of the Black Hand's intentions, decided to assassinate Ferdinand was because they were afraid he'd be too progressive and remove the need for terrorism and anti-Austrian action altogether. Austria-Hungary was more than justified in their harsh terms towards such an unstable and incessantly mischievous nation. The ancient Romans had a festival called Saturnalia where every citizen was seen as an equal to each other. Masters would serve their slaves dinner for instance, and everybody spent the day partying, giving gifts, and getting drunk off their ass through the entire night. And we have written Roman accounts of people complaining about the loud drunks shouting in the streets because they couldn't get any sleep. This festival went on for days in December, and is seen today as sort of a precursor to modern day Christmas, a much better version of Christmas if you ask me. Here's a video by Historia Civilis all about Saturnalia. In the 1300s, the greater part of Central Asia was ruled by Tamerlane, a brilliant leader who took after one of his ancestors, Genghis Khan, in ruthlessness, brutality, and skill. Unlike Genghis Khan, Tamerlane was Muslim, and an important part of his particular cultural beliefs, blending Islam, steppe cultures, and countless other influences, was that one's grave should not be disturbed after death. Being the big shot he was, his grave was magnificent and its location well known. But Tamerlane famously said, "Let no one disturb my grave, for if you do, a fate worse than me will fall upon you." So no one disturbed the tomb. Till Stalin. He let some Soviet archaeologists open it up and examine Tamerlane's body. The locals warned them about the curse that would go into effect after 3 days, but the scientists went ahead with the excavation also on the 19th of June, 1941. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Hitler invaded the USSR. Whether or not you believe in curses, Stalin was apparently spooked enough that, after devastating loss, He ordered the remains be returned, with full ceremony, and the tomb resealed. Very shortly afterwards, the Soviets won the Battle of Stalingrad and turned the tide of Nazi invasion. I would like to give this question extra upvotes to help it make it to the big time. It's a bit more recent, but I love the story of Gander. After 9/11 all the planes were grounded. Almost 7,000 people, which was about 66% of the local population, were forced to land in this tiny town of Gander, Newfoundland. The whole town worked together to make sure all the passengers would have everything they needed. The local ice rink was filled with frozen food that people donated. You couldn't find a closed door in town for stranded people to take a shower or just talk. Once the grounding of planes was lifted, those passengers pooled their money together and created a scholarship for the people of Gander to use. This is one of the greatest acts of kindness that I can view in history. To this day, Gander is the only place outside the United States where they have a piece of the World Trade Center. Operation Bernhard is pretty cool. Basically, Jewish prisoners were made to perfect forgeries of British pounds. The pounds were then to be put into duffel bags and dumped via aircraft into the streets of Great Britain. It was an economic attack to hopefully inflate the pound and destroy the war economy and cripple production. That alone is pretty cool. But what ultimately happened was the project was canned, and the forgeries were sunk on a dredge, and supposedly someone came back later to try and use them but was caught. The raising of Black Wall Street and similar events showing how deeply racist the US has been historically.